I guess we don't pause. Oh, shoot. Okay. Nope.
There you go. Good.
Okay, if that will not move.
Okay.
Okay. Oh. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. We need to make a special welcome to Mike Jordan. Thank him for being here.
Thank you.
The mayor called me yesterday and said, cancel. And I said, why? And they said that he had talked with others in the building and they wanted somebody from Castledale City Council to be here when we're doing this.
Every time?
Every time.
Well, you better watch out, please say terrible
You're gonna subvert it.
But the problem was, and the mayor volunteered to be here, but he is in St. George at a convention. And so he gave me, Mike is on our city council here in Castledale, and the mayor gave me his name, and so I called him, and he was very gracious to come and be with us tonight, so thank you for being here.
Did we get in trouble for anything
Why do we
specific?
have to have a council?
Yeah,
I mean, I'm glad you're here, but why?
You're asking questions I don't have answers to, but I know that if we want to use this room,
Oh,
that's what we have to do.
I had a dream we were.
But no, the mayor was very polite and very kind, and he didn't say anything that we had, anything in particular that we had done. In fact, he didn't even indicate we did anything wrong. It's just what some of, maybe the other entities in here want or whatever. Yeah, I sure do miss
First I've
that.
heard of it, but
What's that?
it's the first I've heard of it, but that's
Yeah.
fine.
I sure do miss that,
I'll be happy.
director of the special service district we used to have around here. I'll bet.
You sure Mike isn't too young for this class?
Probably is.
Well, he probably is.
No,
You'll
I'm
learn a
older.
lot.
I'm older than some of you, I know that.
Wait a second, really?
I'm months away from 70, so I'm right up there. I fit right in.
Well, is that looking okay to you, Gwen? Can you tell? Okay. Hey, thank you for being here. Let me go through the schedule. I know we had some weeks off, and it was important to me because I was able to go to Arizona and pick up my sister and bring her back to spend some time with my mom, which my sister from down there doesn't get to do very often. So that worked out really well. And then I went to a school board meeting, and after this is over, if you would like to discuss the school board meeting, I'd be happy to discuss it off of the air. That's not something we'll discuss here. But it was,
We have got to.
I'd say it wasn't 8 or 9, it was 10s.
Tense.
So if you want to discuss that later, that's fine.
I want to think
We
about
will
it.
be here, of course, this week. We'll be here next week on the 24th, and then we'll be here the next week on the May 1st. So we'll be here 3 weeks in a row, and then they're going to have another school board meeting. And I can't miss that one,
Oh, no.
because it's just like a soap opera.
You
If
can
you
all
miss
come.
them, you can't catch up.
Everybody come.
Anyway,
No, district's imploding.
I do need to go to that school board meeting because I'm learning the issues in case somebody should accidentally vote for me.
We've got to get voted for him.
So, you can't vote for me.
No, I
No, I
really
can't.
You
He's
can't.
mostly from Orangeville, and we've got to
Well,
get out and
okay,
campaign.
Well, enough politics. Oh my gosh. Politics, yeah. Anyway, I want to just review kind of quickly some of the things that we had talked about and catch up. We had started on the Vietnam War, and I spent some time telling you that the Vietnam War did not start with the United States, it started with France. And France turned it over to us. In my opinion, and I will express this as an opinion, we foolishly took it on. And we didn't need Egypt. There was no advantage to us to do it. But we were so fearful of communism that we thought, and President Eisenhower had the belief, that if Vietnam fell, then Cambodia and Laos would fall, and Thailand, and it was the domino theory. And so he was so worried about that, he thought we have to go in and fight for, to keep South Vietnam free. Somebody made the comment, did they think it was another Korea? And I very much think they did. They thought that they could arrange a Korean type truce. But this is not Korea. This is quite different. Okay, and then President Kennedy takes it from about 600 advisors that we send to Vietnam to teach the South Vietnamese how to fight, and massive amounts of money and power to keep this man in office, DM. And then Kennedy comes in, and Kennedy ups the involvement. And he takes us from 600 to 15,000 American troops not allowed to fight. What is that called? They're ROE or what? Rules of engagement. The rules of engagement for these guys was they couldn't shoot their weapon unless they were fired upon.
That's the way it was when I was.
It's ridiculous. But that was the rules.
What kinds of troops were they?
We had been training a new kind of troop, started under Eisenhower, continued under Kennedy, called Green Beret. And a large number of these were Green Beret. They weren't the most elite soldiers, like we like to think sometimes, if you watch John Wayne movies. But they were really well trained to train others. And that's largely what the Green Beret was doing when they weren't allowed to fight. They were training others in weaponry. And that was by 1963, November 1st, Diem is ousted with the help of our CIA. The generals in South Vietnam get rid of Diem and then kill him and his brother. And that is upsetting to Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy tells his brother Robert, we're getting out. We are going to find a way to get out of Vietnam, and we're not going to send any more troops, and we're backing out. When we're participating in assassinations, something's wrong here. And of course, 22 days later, Kennedy's assassinated. And so that didn't happen. So then Johnson takes over, we talked about that. And we talked about, we had a spy ship, the Maddox, that was in the Gulf of Tonkin, picking up radio signals that were taking place in North Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese fired on our ships, torpedoes. There's controversy about that still today. The sonar picked up torpedoes, nobody actually saw torpedoes. And so there's even controversy about
They
that.
didn't hit the submarine, did they?
Our ship, they did not hit it, no, they did not hit our ship. But that was all Lyndon Johnson needed to go to Congress, and he asked for wide-ranging powers, and Congress granted him the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. He couldn't ask, he would not have gotten a declaration of war. So he asked for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which, I mean, to be really honest, gave him more powers. It would be this that he would use as justification to start the draft.
Neil,
Yes, sir.
many years later when they were negotiating the peace there and Henry Kissinger was in France, he asked the envoy from North Vietnam, what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? His reply, not a damn thing.
Yep, exactly. I hope you heard that. Henry Kissinger questioned the envoy that he was negotiating with at the peace talks in Paris. That would have been in about 71 or 2. And he asked what happened there. And the Vietnamese envoy said, not a damn thing. We didn't fire on you.
So,
Do you believe him or not? But honestly, there was never clear evidence that they'd been fired on. So I tend to think Kissinger heard it right, got the right information. What do you think, Mac?
I don't think anything happened there. I think Ho Chi Minh would have used any form of government to get self-government.
I
He didn't care about it.
have to agree. Unlike Stalin or Khrushchev or Brezhnev, who has taken over now at this time, who believed in communism, Ho Chi Minh believed in Vietnam. And he wanted an independent Vietnam, and he would have adopted any political philosophy that would get that for him. And if he adopted communism, both the communist Chinese and the communist Russians would send him weapons and money and whatever he needed. I agree with you. Okay? So Johnson gets wide-ranging powers, and he decides we no longer are going to just be advisors. We are now going to attack. We are going to take American soldiers and take the war to the Vietnamese. And in February of '65, the Viet Cong attack at a place called Pleiku. And Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and General William Westmoreland immediately say, we're being attacked at these places, we need more troops. And Johnson agrees, and he begins sending in combat troops, not advisors, combat troops. Right here in the first part of '65, he sends in 60,000 troops. So by 1965, we have 16,000 troops. Now watch it. Oh, I'm sorry, Tom. Let me say this one thing, and then I'll take your question. By the end of 1965, okay, this is the first of 1965, by the end, we have 184,000 troops in there, and have had 636 deaths. By '68, we'll have 500,000, and we'll have 30,000 deaths. Now, you have a question or comment, Tom?
When Johnson escalated the war, did he have a definition of victory or what the end game was?
No, and that's one of the biggest problems and the biggest knocks on Johnson. How do you know when you've won? Because they're not going to stop shooting at you. How do you know? And what is this war about? In the Civil War, we needed to conquer every state. In World War II, we needed to take over Germany and then Japan. We knew what we had to do. Even in Korea, we knew we had to take enough land to establish that line at the parallel. It's never clearly defined if we win or not. The best we can try to figure is they stop fighting. And is anybody crazy enough to think that Ho Chi Minh and his upper echelon are going to stop fighting? They're not going to do that. They had been fighting from before 1945. They'd fought the Japanese. Then they fought the French. Why would they stop with us?
Well, you gotta go back a little further. What started the whole mess over there was British and French colonialism back in the early 1800s.
Okay, I want to just pass that on. Mac is saying that in the early 1800s, French and British colonialism got this going. And, shortly before that, we were fighting the British for our independence.
Yeah.
And 20, 30 years later, the Vietnamese begin fighting for their independence. But time after time, the United States decided to support those colonialists. So after World War II, after World War I, Ho Chi Minh was at the Treaty of Versailles asking for an independent Vietnam. And they wouldn't give him the time of day. Of course, he was only 19 years old, but still, they wouldn't even give him the time of day. In 1945, at the end of World War II, Ho Chi Minh said to the United States, I fought the Japanese for you. And he did. I fought the Japanese for you. Just give us our independence. That's all we want. And we were worried because he had become a communist. We were very worried about it. And France said, oh no, we want that back. And to reward France for all they'd done for us in World War II, that was a pretty facetious statement right there. We gave it back to them. And $1 billion to help them defend it. And they couldn't hold it. And when France walks out, we had a chance to say, okay guys, good luck. And we didn't take it. Yeah, go ahead.
I've been watching the series on TV, The Crown, and it's not totally factual, but we talked about colonialism a long time ago.
Right.
And how America hasn't tried to take over too much, but I was surprised clear at the time of Queen Elizabeth, at her coronation, they still had colonies, England still had colonies all over the place.
Yes, they did.
India and Australia, and they still have some, but I was just floored at that point in time.
But we wouldn't have colonies, would we?
Well, not a whole
What's
continent.
what's Puerto Rico?
I know about Puerto Rico.
What's Samoa?
It's half and half.
My son's going to Guam. What's Guam?
Guam's American.
But there, Guam doesn't want to be independent.
Well,
France
no,
was,
Puerto Rico doesn't either.
Well,
the loser here, Neil, out of all this World War II business and colonialism, they got Charles de Gaulle.
they did get Charles de Gaulle. Okay.
But, yeah, I'm surprised.
But what I really wanted you to see is how this escalated. In 1 year, 65, you go from 16,000 troops to 184,000 troops, American troops. And again, 500,000 by 68, and 30,000 deaths. This is growing faster than they had ever anticipated. Okay, a couple of things that began to happen, and I think this is about where we left off. In March of 65, Johnson starts Operation Rolling Thunder. No way the Vietnamese could guess what that was going to be. We began bombing of North Vietnam, massive bombing of North Vietnam. We dropped 6 million tons of bombs in 1 year on North Vietnam, which was 3 times the amount we dropped in all of World War II in both the Pacific and the European theaters. So we bombed this place. We massacred it. But you know what? The North Vietnamese were not about to surrender. It made them madder, tougher. Okay.
Was this bombing in North Vietnam or was it all in South Vietnam?
It was North Vietnam. We began bombing in North Vietnam.
What did we bomb?
Jungle, mostly. Some of the pilots really began to complain, and maybe some of you heard some of this, that they were bombing the same piece of jungle over and over, and there was nothing there. Did you hear any of that? Or terrible. Anyway, the U.S. decided we would fight a war of attrition. That is, we will just keep fighting till they give up. And that's how the war will end. Not likely to happen. The NVA, that stands for North Vietnamese Army. That's their actual army of Ho Chi Minh. And the VC, the Viet Cong, a guerrilla army down in the south, now fight a guerrilla war. And they find it very easy to get close, to be a farmer in the day, and at night sneak up close to an American compound and shoot people. And they were not highly moral in the things they did. You'll never be able to accuse these people of a high level of morality. It was not above them to strap explosives onto a little kid and have him run into a bunch of GIs asking for gum. And I hate to tell you, soldiers love little kids and they were happy to give them gum. And then they would detonate the bomb. That's the kind of war that they were fighting against us. Okay? Until Da Nang is where we first landed our combat troops. Way down here is Saigon. They had a big attack on us at Pleiku. And this is Pleiku. It's in the mountains up to next to Cambodia, okay? And we responded to that with a couple of neat things we'd invented. In World War II, we'd invented napalm, which is jelly gasoline. Essentially, you take diesel and styrofoam and you can make this stuff. They were a little better at how they made it, but it was horrible stuff, and it stuck to everything and then ignited. And this is showing one napalm bomb, what a napalm bomb can do. It sticks to the trees, the animals, it sticks to people, it sticks to everything, and it hits, sticks, and ignites that fast. And it's huge explosions, okay? The other great thing we invented was Agent Orange, because we needed to have some bases and things out in the jungle. So the jungle had to die. So we would spray Agent Orange over this stuff, and it was a defoliant. And it killed the jungle and animals that were in the jungle and whatever, and it killed them. And then we would come in with bulldozers and bulldoze that out, and next thing you know, you had a base. The only thing was, we proved that it was a horribly powerful cancer-causing agent. And Gwen had a friend, his name was, can I say his name? I guess I can.
Yeah, he's dead.
Yeah. Dale Trimble, who was in Vietnam, and a couple of different times, he just got covered with Agent Orange while he was out humping in the bush, you know, he's just going through there, and they just poured it on him. And as he came home from Vietnam, he suffered from PTSD quite seriously, but as he was getting better, he had, 3 marriages? Or just 2? Just 2 marriages. Things were tough for him, but he wasn't very old when he got a very strange form of cancer linked to Agent Orange, and he died. And to her credit, his name has been put on the wall in Washington, D.C. And it should have been.
Well, all it was, Neil, was 2,4-D and one other chemical,
Yeah.
which made it so lethal. But to get, the nation refused to do anything about it. All of these servicemen were coming down with all of these diseases. Finally, the Congress had to act.
And they had to act.
They said, and what it came down to was, if you were in country between these dates, we will acknowledge without question that you could have been exposed. And we will also acknowledge that this laundry list of whatever diseases
Cancers and other diseases, yes.
could have been caused by exposure to it.
Yeah.
My
Go ahead, Mike.
brother-in-law said they would stir it by dipping their arm clear to their shoulder in the barrel.
Yeah.
And he died in 1993 of leukemia.
There you go. You guys probably know, the stuff itself wasn't orange, isn't that right? It was clear.
I
But,
never saw it, all I saw was the drums stacked up in the property disposal yard at Longview, 3 high and thousands of them there. And they'd made them quit using it then, or they weren't using it. But you could visibly go by it, and the drums were poor quality, or it ordered them out because it was running out of the drums. And then you'd get the monsoon wind and rain, and I
It's-
suppose that blew it all over Southeast
Just-
Asia.
spread everywhere. Okay.
So why'd they call it orange then?
It was because of the containers that it was in. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The containers that came in. There's one thing I want to make extremely clear. I kind of hate this war. But celebrate the men and women who are in this war. They fulfilled their duty with absolute courage and integrity. And we'll talk about this too later on. How they were treated when they came home was despicable. It was horrible. But I'll tell you about a guy named Joe Galloway. I don't know if you've heard of Joe Galloway. He was a news reporter. He was a reporter. And he wasn't the kind of reporter that sat back in a bar in Saigon and wrote his reports. He was out with the men. And he was at the Battle of Ia Drang that we'll talk about. He was there. And I heard this great interview with him. And he said, people say that our World War II soldiers were the greatest generation. And he said, they were. They were the greatest generation. But he said, our soldiers in Vietnam were the greatest of their generation. And they were not one step behind those great soldiers from World War II. That was Joe Galloway, and he was with them every step of the way. Well, we're in a war now, and we're now fighting it. And in November of 1965, back there at Pleiku, the generals decide they've got to go in there and do something about Pleiku. And what they think is that that's becoming a rallying point for a few hundred, 200-300 North Vietnamese. And we need to go in there and fight them. And we're going to try a new thing. We're going to try the use of helicopters. And we called it air cavalry. We're going to call it air cavalry. And down from the mountains of Pleiku, out of the flats, was what was called the Ia Drang Valley. Here's how you spell it. Ia Drang. Ia Drang Valley. And what we were going to do is we were going to land there, offload soldiers, fly out, get some more, and we were going to establish a kind of fire base there. And then we were going to go looking for the Vietnamese and kill them all. And they began to think this may be the way to fight the war. You drop out of the sky, you fight a quick battle, you kill a lot of the enemy, and you get out. So they began to drop these men in. How many men does that hold, each helicopter?
You can get 6 or 8 in there.
Yeah, you can get 6, and if you really squeeze, you can get 8 in there. What's it going to take to land 800 men? It's going to take 100 helicopters. So they land, get the men out, go back for more, and they don't have to go look for the North Vietnamese in the Ia Drang Valley. The North Vietnamese find them and attack.
They attack before you land.
They attack before you land and when you try to take off again and during. But what you have to know is there were 300 North Vietnamese there. There were 8,000. This was a major gathering place for Viet Cong and NVA, North Vietnamese Army, that they were preparing for a big offensive from there. And we landed right in the middle of it. And we've offloaded 120 soldiers. And so we establish a circle and we make it big enough that more helicopters could come in and bring more men in. And they bring men in and then we load the wounded and the dead and they take them out. And that's how this battle was being fought. And they were trying to get enough men into the Ia Drang Valley. This is the first major battle for American troops in South Vietnam. 2 men wrote about it. Colonel Hal Moore with Joe Galloway. He was that reporter, and he's a good writer. And so Colonel Hal Moore, who was over this operation, and Joe Galloway wrote the story, and it's called "We Were Soldiers and Young." If you ever want to read a really heartbreaking book, We were soldiers once and young. And if you want to watch a heartbreaking movie, watch the movie of it, which is called We Were Soldiers. It stars Mel Gibson. And this ends up, they call him Broken Arrow. I'll tell you what that means in just a minute. In 4 days, 234 U.S. were killed in action. 234 men died in 4 days there. We were surrounded. And yet we couldn't collapse. We couldn't collapse anywhere and drop back because they would overrun us. The men just had to stay there and keep fighting in this circle. Okay? This is kind of what it looked like. This is a picture Joe Galloway took of them fighting against, on one part of that circle, that line. And this is a very famous photograph he took of the wounded that they've got ready to evacuate there. This is also a pretty famous. Joe Galloway, he wrote his own articles, he took his own pictures too. And this is what it was about. Yes. Oh, go ahead.
And a lot of, like, what was the draft age? Because these were boys.
They were 18.
Yeah, these were boys.
But in 65, they weren't allowed to vote yet.
Yeah.
That wouldn't happen for a while. 71. Go ahead.
Was there even any cover? Was this one of the places Agent
You
Orange?
can see the cover. Sometimes there were a few little trees and there was grass.
Was it tree?
There was this they called the ditch or the trench they got down in there. That's what you had.
Because you think of Vietnam, you think of jungle, but if they wiped out,
Well, there were grasslands too, and up in Pleiku there were these grasslands.
Most of it was jungle, what they cleared, and I think I was there on, we set up several bases in places, I think, where Agent Orange cleared the area from the jungle.
Yeah,
And most of it, 95% of it was still jungle.
you can kill the jungle and then bulldoze it out and have a base. When you leave it for a few years, it would grow back. Yeah. So this was our first major battle. Almost nobody got out without some wounds. Joe Galloway talks about how more they're being overrun. The circle is closing in. If it closes in too much, you can't land your helicopters. It means you can't bring more people in and you can't get those people out. You can't bring ammunition in. And so how Broken Arrow, which means drop the napalm right on top of us. The enemy is inside of our circle. Drop it on us. And so the next jet in did exactly that. And Halmore describes in that book how it was too close to some of our soldiers. And when it caught everything on fire, it caught them on fire too. And a medic was screaming, "Come and help me." So Galloway drops his camera and he runs over and he grabs the one soldier's feet to pull him out, and his feet come off. Like I say, if you can handle it, read this book. If you can handle it. We lost 2,340 U.S. killed. We know we killed well over 2,300 Vietnamese in there. We fought and we fought. I'll tell you about one little story. One part of the line, there was a first lieutenant. I think he might have been a second lieutenant. Anyway, he came in, he was there, and he gets his men to lay down, and they have a little bit of cover, a little bit of a ditch there, and they're fighting, and the enemy just decides that's the place they're going to break through, and they really hit his part of the circle, and the men are starting to back up, and you can tell they're going to run. So this lieutenant stands up and does this craziest thing. He stands up and he starts singing in a real loud baritone voice. And he sings a song he learned from his homeland. He was from England. He wasn't from the United States. He was also not an American citizen yet. And he stood up and he began to sing. And the song was called Men of Harlech. Stand ye ready. In the United States, we've changed it and call it Men of Freedom now. We have that song. But he stood up singing. He was wounded, but he kept singing, and the men stopped retreating. And they held, and they stood. They fought. And finally, the enemy had had enough, and they backed off. And the helicopters came in and took them all and took them out. And a day later, they sent another group in there to recon and find out where the enemy was. And they were absolutely massacred and slaughtered. We didn't learn anything. But the generals, William Westmoreland and some of the others, boy, their eyes light right up. We killed 2,300 of the enemy. That's a 1 to 10 kill ratio. And they report this back up the chain. And now they know how to tell if we win the war.
Body count.
Body count. It all became about body count.
That's awful.
It all became about body count. And that's what the upper people wanted to know. So soon that's what your colonels and majors and captains wanted to know. How many of them did we kill?
That was every day on the news, I remember.
It was. And I remember watching the news as a kid, and they would come on and say, 273 Americans died in Vietnam today. And they had all these little cutout shadows that they put up showing that. And you know, the body count remained the same through the whole war, 1 to 10. 1 to 10. But did Ho Chi Minh care about that?
No.
Not at all. They weren't real people to him. They were freedom fighters or something else. And the war became about body count at this point in time. Okay? Opposition begins to grow. The war had a big effect on the U.S. economy. Did any of you, some of you might have been old enough to remember some of this, that the economy began to suffer because we were pouring everything into weapons and men and training and materials, and our economy was hit by this. When government spends too much money, it can hurt the economy. And that's what exactly was happening. America divides into two camps. Hawks were for the war and for Lyndon Johnson. Doves were against the war, and their leader that emerges is a guy by the name of J. William Fulbright. He's a senator, and he emerges as kind of the leading opponent of the war in the Senate. They were both Democrats, to show you how politics worked in those days. It wasn't Republican versus Democrat. Yes?
Is that the Fulbright Scholarship?
He is the man that founded the Fulbright Scholarship. And that is still awarded today. He had the money to do that, and it's still awarded today for outstanding scholars in America. We have the draft code. Now, to give you the statistics, 2.5 million men from the United States served in Vietnam, 2.5 million. 1.5 million were drafted, so 1 million were volunteers or career soldiers. 1.5 were drafted. Males had to register when they were 18, and the draft kind of came to be seen as unfair. Did any of you feel that way at the time, that it was somewhat unfair?
Well, I know.
Go ahead, Jan.
My first husband, when I met him, had to go register for the draft, and he stayed in college, and his number came up 8, which he was a number 8, but because he was in college, he didn't go, and that's all that kept him in college for the whole rest of the war. He never did get a degree. So, you know, it wasn't totally fair.
That was something at first that could defer you. Being married could defer you. A lot of people ran and got married. Having children could defer you, but as the war went on and as we needed more men, those deferments gave away. The LDS Church had a deferment for missions. You could send one person on a mission from each ward per year. That's all you could send.
Well, what governed the whole thing was what they called the selective service system.
Yes.
And it was, the governing agency for it was local draft boards in so many communities. And men selected to sit on that board had the names of available soldiers.
And they had a lot of power, those boards.
They had a lot of power there, and it was seen as, well, it wasn't very honest, I guess.
Yeah.
But in 1969, it changed
They changed it.
to a lottery system. Otherwise, you got
And it
360.
looked very much like bingo.
Yeah.
I remember our
365 days
family
a year.
sitting together as a family, watching them draw out the birth dates
Yeah, that
to
was.
see if my uncle
Yeah.
was high on the list or low on the list. And I also had an uncle who who got married and got a deferment, and then that was said, oh, that doesn't matter now, and had a kid, so they got a deferment. That's okay. And he was in college. That was all wiped out, and he finally was going to be drafted. So he did all he could do. He went and signed up and joined as an officer, hoping that while he went to officer candidate school, that the war would end, and it didn't.
Yeah. I was at the U and there were a lot of people in the ROTC hoping the same thing.
Well, you have some people even today that did some interesting things, not just ROTC. What about the National Guard? If you were in the Utah National Guard or whatever, the Texas National Guard, you didn't get drafted because you were serving your country. But, and you may not realize, we didn't send the National Guard over there. We had during Korea, we'd sent the National Guard there. But mostly we didn't send the National Guard from here. And that's how George W. Bush stayed out of Vietnam. His dad got him in as a pilot in the National Guard. And I think you all know about President Trump. He had sore feet. He had sore feet. He had something wrong with his feet and couldn't go. So there were things that could keep you from going. I have.
Blame any of those people for not going? I can't blame them for not going.
How can I say this? I can blame when your daddy is rich enough to get you out of it.
Yeah.
Which is the case with, without a doubt, George W. Bush.
Well, and there were also a lot from the University of Utah that transferred to a college in Canada.
People ran for Canada.
And do we blame them for doing that? I know that we blame them, but why? I don't blame them.
Do we blame them?
I think society blamed them a lot.
Well, let's go beyond society. We have people who served. How did you feel about draft dodgers?
I didn't like that.
What's that?
I say I didn't like that. I served my country. I don't like draft dodgers.
It's hard to go serve when other people are running away.
I agree with that. And from
This
what
is a good-
I've
this is a
heard
good
tonight,
discussion.
Nobody should have served. However, the country should have treated these young men with dignity, and what they did was not their fault. It was the politicians' fault.
Okay, well, let's look at this.
So I turned 18 in 1969 and I lost the draft.
You lost, yeah.
My lucky number was
My uncle lost it
about 4.
3 times.
My brother
And I
always
got my
got.
greetings and salutations from Richard Plastics.
Oh. Hey, thanks, a nice letter.
Why
Gwen's
did
brother
that?
was low, right?
No, he was higher.
And so what happened? Oh, he had asthma.
Well, he didn't, they never called his, yeah, he didn't.
Why don't you just join the Navy?
Thought
You're
people did.
not gonna have to.
Some did. But do you think the Navy wasn't fighting in Vietnam, too?
Well, yeah, but they wouldn't have had the same numbers of casualties or whatever if they're on a ship out there.
but
Well,
also,
they were on the Brownwater River.
yeah, when we're,
With gunboats.
up the rivers were all Navy. And they had a higher death rate than most others. That was dangerous, those rivers.
I have a question.
Yes.
I had an nephew that served in Antigua. Now, what did Antigua have to do? I know he worked on the air. He would repair, they would repair the airports after the plane. All these planes were coming in and landing and taking off there. From there, does anybody know what
I don't
Antigua
know.
had to do with Vietnam?
But we had soldiers in Germany, we had soldiers in Korea still.
Okay,
We had soldiers around the world. That's what we had to draft, is we were spread thin.
okay.
But here's something to show you. Deferment's given disproportionately high for poor and black, meaning, a good example is 10% of Americans were black, but 20% of combat deaths in Vietnam were black. I don't know.
And it was probably the same with the standard of living, just like you said.
Well, I think there should be a law that any politician that sends our boys over for war needs to send their sons.
First,
Period. That's right. I don't care how much money they have.
For a long time, all of
That'll
those
never
things
happen.
were.
what's that?
That will never happen.
No, it won't happen.
I know, but it was a
It's
good-
because of the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules.
That's right.
That's
Okay, that was a good discussion. On November of 1965, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, suspends Operation Rolling Thunder to get the Vietnamese to agree to peace talks. And so they go to Paris for peace talks. And the peace talks are not going well. The very first thing you got to figure out is what shape should the table that you negotiate around be?
Oh, that sounds familiar.
By 1966, the talks fail, and this year becomes one of seek and destroy missions for both the U.S. and North Vietnam. So now our whole strategy is not capture territory. Not capture territory. If you want to see again another book and great movie about Hamburger Hill, that we lost hundreds of men trying to take that hill, and we took it, and then marched off of it and gave it back to them. The basic soldier could not understand what they were fighting for.
That was me.
There you go. And the people at the top knew what it was about. Again, Mac, what was it?
Body count.
Body count.
Yeah.
Did we kill enough of them today?
No.
Never was going to be able to. In 67, the seek and destroy missions continue. We're doing it, the North Vietnamese are doing it. You know, if you kill 600 North Vietnamese, it's not going to appear on the news in Vietnam. That's not going to happen. But if 34 Americans died that day, it's going to be on the news. And this is the first war that is covered live. This is the first war that's covered live. So 66 and 67 are just about body count and just both sides out there trying to kill people. Anti-war protests begin to largely move onto college campuses. And those protests become, some of them, really huge. Was anybody at the University of Utah when the students took over the president's office?
I was there, but I wasn't in the president's office.
Okay, Jan's there, she wasn't in the president's office.
No.
But they did, they took over the University of Utah and they came in. The president of the University of Utah opposed the Vietnam War, and when they came in and said, we're taking over your office, he stood up and said, I want to wish you the best. Good luck. And he left.
And they almost, I don't remember how they targeted the ROTC building, but it was also attacked to some degree and overrun also.
Yeah.
I had a hard enough time just getting through college, but I wasn't, but you know, I have regrets as I look back now. I'm sure I was carrying a sign somewhere.
1968 is the turning point of the war. 1968. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, is what it's called. It's not exactly the same time as ours, but it's in January. And this man right here, William Westmoreland, came out and said, the war's about over. We've about got it won. They cannot take losses like this and continue. The war is nearly done. It was kind of like we told them in Korea, the boys will be home for Christmas. And then the Chinese entered the war. Well, that's what was happening kind of here. Go ahead, Lee.
It's kind of funny because in January 1968, when I was there, we lost 33 of my company in one day,
In Tet.
in Tet.
So Lee just told us that he was there in country in Vietnam in January of '68, and 33 men from his company were killed in this offensive.
One
right
day.
here. One day. One day.
Can you show us a couple of things on the war? Where's Saigon?
Okay, good to know. This is Saigon down here,
Okay,
way down in the south.
okay,
And places you may have heard of is Hue,
uh-huh.
up in North Quezon, Hue,
Okay.
Da Nang. These should be names that if you were alive during then you probably knew.
Where's the Mekong River?
Right here.
Okay, it's
This
way
is
down
this-
south.
This is this big river system. And the Navy had responsibility for that.
That's what I thought.
And they ran boats up and down that river constantly. Okay. Well, at Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, up until '68, everybody, the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, the Americans, had called for a ceasefire during Tet. It would be like us having a Christmas ceasefire. So everybody agreed for a ceasefire. And that's when the North Vietnamese attacked. And they attacked en masse, like no attack they had ever attacked. And they attacked 36 province capitals. Provinces are like states. They would be our state capitals if we were talking about in America. 36 of those, and then 5 other important cities, all at the same time, all on the same day. Now, Lee, where were you when this happened?
You see where Da Nang is,
Yes,
and the Ho Nan,
yes.
Tam Kỳ. I was at Tam Kỳ in July.
Okay, so this is where Lee was when that happened. And they attacked all at once, massive attack. And it was tough. They took over the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. They captured our embassy. The U.S. and ARVN is the South Vietnamese soldiers. The U.S. and ARVN then fight back. And if you ever saw courageous American soldiers, it was during this. And they fought back, and we took back every city, every one. It took us almost 3 months to take them all back. Maybe it would leave them a little more than 3 months. The last one we took back, I think, was Da Nang. But we fought back and took everything back, and we killed hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese. And we won the battle. And we lost the war that day, that 3-month period. See, this guy had been telling us the war's almost over. And we figured out it wasn't almost over. It wasn't over if they could do that. The end of the war is not in sight. There's some pictures from the Tet Offensive. These were Marines trying to take back the embassy in Saigon, and we took it back. Helping to evacuate a wounded American soldier. This picture made it to all over the news. This was a captured prisoner of war, and this was the head of the South Vietnamese security. He was like the head of the CIA for South Vietnam. And he walked up, and the people who captured him thought that he was going to question him, and he walked up, pulled out his pistol, and shot him in the head. Now, that probably wasn't the most violent thing that happened there. In fact, I'm sure it wasn't, but it was on the news. and everybody saw it. This was a picture from it. They saw it on the news. It was filmed.
Did they notice though? I mean, that's the thing, they're fighting against their own people. The North Vietnamese look just like the South Vietnamese. I mean, no wonder they could infiltrate places and they didn't even know who the enemy was.
But here's the thing, who the Americans were.
Well, yeah, that's who they
But
voted to.
you gotta know how Ho Chi Minh thought. If you want freedom, you sacrifice lives.
Even your own countries. Especially your own countries.
That offensive. The U.S. and the Allies lost 5,000 men in that 3 to 4 month period right there. The VC and MBA lost, we know, about 50,000. We kept that 1 to 10 ratio in this. And we hurt them. I mean, it took it out of them. It was going to be a while before they could really respond in force. They didn't have the people now to mount a huge, big campaign. But they would go back to their guerrilla war and still be fighting everywhere around. But they couldn't mount something like that again for more than a year, I'm sure. So this right here is support for Lyndon Johnson from 65 to 68. And this starts out in January of 1965, and look what's happening. You can just trace it. And as we are really escalating and we go to seek and destroy missions, we hit a low point. And then he begins bombing in Hanoi and Haiphong, and the American people say, well, maybe this will work. And so support for Lyndon Johnson rises, and then it's not working, and it continues, and it's going on, and urban unrest is taking place. This is 1967, okay? They meet with the Soviets in 1967, and American public are hopeful. And then, this is the Tet Offensive right here. That's the public support at the Tet Offensive. And this is based on 25% support to 75% support. Look where the support of the American people is at Tet, when Tet happens.
Is that based on polls?
It is. Polls and surveys. And that brought it down to under 40% of the American people supported the Vietnam War. The tide has turned. Now, they kind of come out of it when they begin to say, well, there's going to be, or no, this is not the Tet Offensive, this is coming out. But this is when, I'm sorry, William Westmoreland says, we're at the light at the end of the tunnel. The war's almost won. And he comes up a little bit. This is Tet Offensive. And that's 35% of America still in favor of war. And then LBJ gets a big boost in popularity. Do you know what he does for that big boost? He withdraws from the campaign. He says, I won't run for president. And look what that does for his popularity. It shoots him up here. And then comes the Democratic Convention, and his popularity is at the lowest ever. I'm going to turn this light on, sorry.
What?
Question.
Yes, go ahead.
If not for the Russian support, could the North Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh
have done all they did? It's highly doubtful. But would they have given up? I don't think so. I don't think so. Go
I
ahead,
have a
Dan.
question too, and there's probably no way to answer it, but if Kennedy had lived even another 6 months, or if he'd finished his term, do you think we would have had this?
No.
Because he was gonna pull out.
I have to agree with Mac. If Kennedy had somehow lived for even another 6 months or so, we are out of Vietnam, and we're saying to him, good luck, China and Russia. You just adopted a very dangerous baby.
Because, I mean, you know, that's like
See,
know that.
the thing of it is, we view Vietnam as an ally of Russia and China. Do you know after this war is over, and I'll show you that later, Vietnam and China go to war against each other? We did not understand what was going on there, and yet we were going to fix it all with a war. We didn't even understand it. Whoever got to have Vietnam on their side was asking for trouble.
Another question, was NATO created and was anybody besides the United States fighting in Vietnam?
Yes, NATO had been created, but NATO is the North Atlantic
North Atlantic.
Treaty Organization. We started CETO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, CETO. And there were Australians that fought here. There were Indonesians that fought with us. There was a terrifying group of soldiers that came and fought in Vietnam, and they may have been the ones that North Vietnamese were most afraid of. They were Koreans. They were kind of prisoners, war prisoners. So yeah, we had others fighting,
Yeah.
but not to the tune of 500,000 people, you know. The British sent troops. Okay. Then, the Tet Offensive isn't even quite over, and there's people running, and Lyndon Johnson runs in the New Hampshire primary, the first primary, and he barely wins it. And the guy who's second is just right, and his name's Eugene McCarthy. And his platform is end the Vietnam War. That's Eugene McCarthy. And Lyndon Johnson sees that and begins to consider, and he's seen those polls, he knows where his popularity is. And so he comes out April 1st, tells the nation he won't run, and that he's going to stop the bombing of North Vietnam. And so that's what he said. Here he is giving that speech. Here was the picture they took of him writing that speech as he comes out. Did anybody hear that speech?
Yeah.
I heard it. I was just a little kid. But my dad's funny. He made us watch the news every night, and we had to gather around and watch the speech by Lyndon Johnson.
It was a special era.
It was.
It wasn't a news hour.
No, it wasn't during the news hour. It was. And so,
It was cut off. That's what I remember.
yeah, my dad made us watch news, but something like this, we were going to be there. Okay? And that's from the Washington Post.
And what's the date on that again?
April 1st,
What year?
68.
Well, that means I wasn't at the U yet.
Do you know where you were?
I know where I was.
Yeah.
I maybe wasn't even at the U yet. I
You were in the north
graduated
part of
till
South
70.
Vietnam.
I still remember.
Okay?
Maybe I just
Remember, Johnson escalated this because he did not want to be the president, the first president of the United States to lose a war. And he just lost. And when you look at it, he just lost. So, the election is coming. It's 1968, it's April. And these three emerge. Eugene McCarthy, anti-war, highly anti-war. Robert Kennedy, mostly anti-war. JFK's younger brother. He was opposed to the war. There was a little difference. Eugene McCarthy was, elect me president, the next day everybody comes home. Robert says, elect me president, and as quickly as we can, we'll bring everybody home. Hubert Humphrey is the vice president of the United States. Hubert H. Humphrey from Minnesota, vice president of the United States. He did not run in a single primary. He doesn't run in a single primary. But the caucuses, the states have caucuses, urged him to run, and he was picking up caucus votes. And he is starting to emerge as one of the leaders. And there's a man standing behind him pulling the strings. It's Lyndon Johnson. And in fact, he made a statement that Lyndon Johnson didn't like one time. Oh, I don't know, it was about the bombings. He said maybe we shouldn't have discontinued the bombings. And he gets a call from Lyndon Johnson, and then he's on the news the next night saying, no, we probably should continue the bombings. Changed his mind on that. So he was very much he was a puppet for what Johnson wanted. And these three are running for the nomination. Then, just a few days after Johnson pulls out of the election, Martin Luther King is assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. This is him laying here. These were people who were with him. They're pointing where the shot came from. It took a couple months before they found James Earl Ray and extradited him from England, where he'd run to. But he confessed to shooting Martin Luther King, and then a little while later he recanted his confession. So, and he would die in prison. How did that affect things in Vietnam when Martin Luther King was killed? You were there. Do you remember this?
I don't remember that.
Remember? Large numbers of African Americans in Vietnam said, we're not going to fight anymore. And the government had a crisis on their hands because many, many African Americans were right in the thick of the fighting. They said, we're done. And eventually they were persuaded to keep going. But this was a huge blow to the nation. How big? There were over 100 riots that took place when that news got out across the nation. And would you like to know the number of people that died in those riots? 400. 400 people died in the rioting, both people trying to stop the riots and people trying to riot, upon the news of the death of Martin Luther King Jr.
Was that when they had the Watts riot in LA, or is that?
No, they'll come later. Then, this was in March when Martin Luther King was assassinated. June 5th, 2 months later, Robert Kennedy is emerging as the man to beat. He's going to be the one that's going to become the nominee for the Democratic Party. And more than that, he just wins the California primary. And he's got all those delegates from California, the most populous state even then, but still the most populous state. And he wins the California primary, and they have a big celebration, and they're taking him out through the kitchen when a Palestinian named Sirhan Sirhan steps forward and shoots Robert Kennedy, and he dies there on the floor of the door going into the kitchen. Do any of you remember this?
This was just a terrible time in history, this whole horrible.
And what was his reason for killing?
He never would say
He never did say. We put him on Twitter or whatever.
nothing. Okay? Then comes August. That's June. 2 months later, it's the Republican National Convention in Miami, Florida. Now that's where you have a convention.
Jackie Gleason.
What's that?
Have it with Jackie Gleason.
Jackie Gleason, right there, the honeymooners. Nixon came out, and his promise was, I will give you peace with honor. Peace with honor. Now, who was he playing to, the Doves or the Hawks? And his answer was, he was playing to both of them. I will give you peace with honor. Overwhelmingly wins the nomination. He overwhelmingly wins the nomination. He beats a guy that had been the governor of California, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan got 1.5% of the delegates. 1%, 1.5% of the delegates. Nixon overwhelms them and is the nominee from the Republicans.
Is that Gerald Ford behind him?
It is. Later on, Gerald Ford would become his vice president for a little while.
The person nobody voted for.
Yeah. Now we go to the Democratic convention. Again, who's pulling the strings? They decide to hold it off and not have it close to the Republican convention. They want it on LBJ's birthday. And it was to be kind of a big time to honor what LBJ had done. Say thanks, Mr. President, for doing this for us. LBJ did not attend. He's President of the United States, he didn't attend. August 26th and 29th, 1968, Hubert Humphrey defeats Eugene McCarthy significantly by more than 60%. He beats McCarthy. Kennedy's delegates were split, but Hubert Humphrey becomes the nominee of the Democratic Party, and it all goes to pieces. Yes, Tom.
Wasn't McCarthy from South Dakota?
No, he was from. Somebody's gonna have to get their phone out and look it up. Yeah, it would be the next one that Nixon would run against. That was from South Dakota.
Oh.
Quick, what's his name? McGovern, thank you. McGovern was from South Dakota. But McCarthy wasn't. I'm trying to remember where he is from. All of the anti-war people who'd showed up for the convention, some of them were not seated. They were delegates. They'd gone through the process, and the convention refused to seat them. And the top blew off the Democratic convention.
He was
And
born,
there was-
born in Watkins, Minnesota.
Minnesota. So you got two Minnesota boys running against each other. It was massive fighting. This is what the convention looked like. And the National Guard was called in, and look what those people are doing. And interestingly enough, they're using both fingers. That made me, okay. They're giving them a peace sign. And people were beat up, and people were bruised, and on both sides, and it was horrible. Who remembers the Democratic Convention? I sure do. It scared the crap out of me.
Because I had a dad like you.
Yeah, I was having to watch it on TV, and I'm like,
I was in high school.
oh, great. And it was led by the Chicago 8, and then Bobby Seale would be excused by the judge. The judge said, there's no evidence against you. And it became the Chicago 7, and they were put in jail, convicted of causing these riots, along with their attorneys who went to jail for too vigorous of a defense of them. And it was some of the worst rioting America has ever seen, was that Chicago convention.
Was it all over not being seated?
No, the main thing was it was all over Eugene McCarthy not being the nominee. It was that you elected the That's what it was really about. And so this is the election of 1968, one of the most amazing elections in American history. Richard Nixon versus Hubert Humphrey versus a guy who started his own party. George Wallace, who started his own party, which was known as the Segregationist Party. And he was running on the fact that the federal government should not tell states that they have to be desegregated. That states should be segregated if they want. Okay? So, George Wallace had a pretty good idea that he was going to get enough votes that he was going to decide the election. And he would give the election to the man who would back segregation in the South. And so Richard Nixon wins 31,783,000 votes. Hubert Humphrey, 31,271,000 votes. Wallace knew it was going to be close, and he was right. Wallace wins 9 million votes. But
That's his block in the
it's
South.
the Electoral College that makes the difference. It's where you win your votes. And Nixon got 301 electoral votes, and Hubert Humphrey 191. Now, I know there's people who hate the Electoral College. I am not one of them. Because the Electoral College makes things like this happen. The Electoral College makes us is it doesn't let politicians forget small states. So I'm highly in favor of the Electoral College, and I think our founding fathers that was part of what they were putting together. They recognized that fact. But George Wallace gets 46 electoral votes. He wins these states: Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and he wins some votes. Kentucky split their votes, and he got some of the votes from Kentucky. And if you'll remember who George Wallace was, he was the governor of Alabama. And in the middle of all this, he went and stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa, stood in the doorway and said, "No blacks ever." And here's his famous quote. You remember his quote? "Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever."
This is in 1968.
This is in 1968, during your lifetime. And his plan is, if he could get, he really planned on getting Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, he hoped maybe for Virginia, even, and possibly North Carolina. He was planning on getting enough electoral votes that he could throw the election to the person that would back segregation. And it didn't happen. And who's to be thanked? The Electoral College. And so Nixon wins what looks like a great victory. And George Wallace loses. We'll talk about George Wallace later on, what happens to him.
Get shot.
Oh, now you've ruined it for me. There would be an assassination attempt on George Wallace. He did die.
He spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair.
He did. Okay, I'll ruin it for you. He later on he was no longer the governor. He decided to run for governor of Alabama yet again. While campaigning, a person stepped forward and shot him in the back. It severed his spinal cord. He spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. And oddly enough, his politics changed because in Alabama, by that time, you couldn't win if you didn't get the black vote. And suddenly, he wasn't for segregation anymore.
He was a flake.
He was a flake. Okay, how are we doing? About peace talks in 68, then peace talks stalled out. The Vietnamese want our rioters to win the war for them. They don't want to have to do it for themselves. Plus, they've not recovered from Tet. That really hammered the North Vietnamese. But as Nixon comes in, he says, "I have a better idea. Let's do a thing called Vietnamization." Anybody of you remember hearing that phrase? Nixon's big thing was Vietnamization. He said, we're going to restart the bombing that Johnson stopped, and we're going to increase it. And we are, remember his great quote, going to bomb them back to the Stone Age. And he begins round-the-clock bombing of North Vietnam. And now he's focusing more on less jungle, more important targets. Okay? The next thing he says is we're going to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where the North Vietnamese come down from Laos, Cambodia, and into South Vietnam to fight us. We're going to start bombing in Laos and Cambodia and destroy that Ho Chi Minh Trail. And he says, and then we're going to bring home more troops than we send in. So we're still going to send troops over there, new troops over there. But we're going to, if we send 5,000 in a month, we'll bring home 8,000. And we'll gradually step down how many troops we have there. And this is how his plan worked. When he takes over in January, there are 550,000 American troops in Vietnam. And this is what he does. This is 69, 70, 71, and the end of 72. 550,000, 27,000. He is stepping it down. And he's saying peace with honor. Meanwhile, he's stepping up the bombings. Who is he trying to please, the hawks or the doves?
That's 72 is when he was the last of the draftees.
Right. And that will end the draftees.
November of 72.
Also, part of his plan is that the ARVN, the South Vietnamese, will begin then to take over the ground war. And that when you're dropping from 550,000 troops down to 27,000 troops, if you want to have a war, you got to turn it over to somebody else. So we're turning it over to the South Vietnamese, and more our soldiers who are still fighting, they're even becoming more trainers of the ARVN. So there's kind of going back to what Kennedy had done. And then he begins secret bombings of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. You may have heard of the Christmas bombings. He thought everybody in America would be so busy with Christmas they wouldn't notice that he was blowing the crap out of 2 other countries. And then he sends troops in there. And so some of the troops that are still there, along with ARVN troops, made into Cambodia and into Laos. And we capture massive weapons that the North Vietnamese have, and we destroy them. This is real controversial still. Did we do the right thing to attack into those other countries to destroy that trail? Well, the Viet Cong and the NK are continuing to fight. They're finding it harder. But when it comes out that we were bombing over Christmas, and this is a B-52, riots break out on campuses for Nixon. And the worst one is at Kent State. And the riots are taking place at Kent State, and the National Guard is called in, and the National Guard is trying to get the crowd under control, and somebody starts shooting. Somebody in the National Guard, we know from the bullets, started shooting. And 4 students were killed. And this picture won a Pulitzer Prize for the best picture of that year of this young man that had been killed by the National Guard. And the country's having a hard time asking, are we shooting home people now? At Jackson State, the National Guard killed 2 more students during a riot. But in New York City, there's a counter demonstration, a big march in support of Nixon. So he gained a lot he had support for what he was trying to do. And then came the My Lai massacre. In 1968, U.S. soldiers burned the village of My Lai. My Lai is really actually kind of a trail with 5 little villages on it. The whole area is called My Lai. There was a helicopter pilot that was bringing people in and hauling people out, and he had a camera. His name was Thompson. And he took a picture of these people being rounded up and herded out of their village. But they called out to another place. And when he flew back there, this is what he saw. Somewhere between 400 and 500 unarmed Vietnamese had been rounded up, herded into this place and others, and then had been shot to death. He took this picture too. Yet he reports it. He reports it to the authorities. And the authorities say, oh, are you kidding? He did that? In 1968, he reports it. And it goes nowhere. Nobody does anything. And he won't let it go. And he eventually gets out of the Army, this helicopter pilot, and then he blows the lid off it. And it all comes out, and he shows him his pictures, and he goes to the press, and he goes to everywhere, and now the Army wants to hear what he has to say. And they arrest, in 1971 now, Lieutenant William Calley, and he is court-martialed. Now that brings up a problem. They can't. Lieutenant Calley was in charge of the platoons that were there. But his captain over him said to him, kill everything that moves. But when his captain, they came to arrest him, he said, I didn't say that. And now it all becomes a big he said, she said, and somebody's got to pay.
Well, Medina was exonerated.
Captain Medina, and he was let go. Calley is arrested, they know Cali gave the order. Cali's only argument is it came from above. And it didn't wash with the court-martial. He was then sentenced, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But he never went to prison. He was appealing and he was fighting it, and he was put under house arrest on the base in the South somewhere. I don't remember which base it was. He was put under house arrest. He was allowed to have his girlfriend come and visit him. He was a house arrest meant he could go walk around the base. Couldn't leave the base, but he had a place he stayed. He could have his girlfriend come in. He could give interviews to reporters, for which he charged money. He serves 3 years under house arrest, and Nixon pardons him.
Neil, when I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, serving as a military rider in Building 35, Cali had an assignment there on the same building.
Okay?
None of this had broken yet. And I would meet the guy frequently.
Okay.
Of course, of going through the building.
Let me tell you. So Mac worked right alongside Cali in a building, Fort Benning, Georgia. Okay.
When I left there was a major who came to the department, and he was in the department head, Arthur Brown. Brown ended up being the guy that was in charge of the court martial that tried Lieutenant Cali. Major Brown served two assignments in Vietnam on the ground as a ground commander. And when all of this stuff was out in the public, and they found him guilty, and Major Brown made a remark that said, what really hurt was that a fellow officer would do that.
Yeah. Yeah. This was hard. Boy, this tore our country apart. This was hard. While he was in house arrest, Esquire magazine came and interviewed him. And you know, Esquire magazine brought along some people. This, by the way, is their most famous cover, and Esquire magazine sold more of this magazine than they ever have. That's on the cover.
This was on the cover.
That's Rusty. That was his nickname, Lieutenant William Cali. The writer brought some Vietnamese children with him and had them all stand around her while he took pictures of Lieutenant William Cali with Vietnamese children. Do you think that was upsetting? You can see why people bought this magazine to read this? I'm just going to say this. These two especially don't look real happy to be there. All right.
Whatever happened to him? Is he still alive?
He's still, the last I heard, he's still alive. He's nearly 80 now. He doesn't give very many interviews, but he does, and it's about $20,000 per interview.
I will say this is right. I must have just paid attention to news because I had a dad like yours, but I graduated in 1970, so 71 was my first year at the University of Utah, and this is what I grew up to.
Yeah.
Well, when was Jane Fonda over there?
She was over there in 71. And
She's
we're
the one that screwed things up in the.
going to talk about her later. Maybe we shouldn't talk about her.
Yeah, we better talk about it.
We will.
Yeah. See.
We'll be talking. I've got a lesson on traders, and that's where I'm going to talk about her. Because that's where she belongs. Nixon is re-elected in 1972. He's very popular. He's in defeats George McGovern, and George McGovern wins only one state, Massachusetts.
Oh my gosh.
He got a few delegates from other states who broke and voted for him. Altogether, he got 14 from Massachusetts and 3 more. He got 17 electoral votes. Nixon got 520 electoral votes. It's the greatest electoral landslide in American history. How funny. McGovern was from, you said it, South Dakota, Here's South Dakota. He voted for Nixon. Even his own state wouldn't vote for him.
I remember Muskie from Maine.
Muskie from Maine.
Did McGovern beat him out?
Yes, Muskie ran with Humphrey as vice president in the previous election in '68. And Muskie was running against McGovern. When some people called the plumbers that worked for Nixon started Muskie was ahead. It looked like Muskie might be the guy. And they began to harass him in different ways. And giving a speech, he became emotional. He started to cry a little bit, Muskie did. And boy, Nixon's people took pictures of that and made sure it was all in the newspaper and basically said, can somebody who breaks down in the middle of the president? And for me, the answer is that's kind of probably who you want.
Yeah.
But it ruined Muskie's political career. And got McGovern, who they wanted. They wanted McGovern. And then McGovern's, what was his vice presidential candidate? Eagleton. Eagleton ran with McGovern. And Eagleton had a history of some mental illness. And the plumbers for Nixon brought that out, and that hit the paper, and McGovern lost his vice presidential candidate, and it was just all falling apart.
Wasn't one of McGovern's plans to legalize marijuana?
It was to legalize marijuana, and he was really hoping, because in '71, 18-year-olds got the right to vote, and he was really hoping that would swing it for McGovern. And McGovern was hoping those kind of issues would swing it for him. So, the massive bombing appears maybe to be working. The Vietnamese come to the Paris Peace Accords in '73, and finally we signed a peace treaty. Ho Chi Minh had died back in '71, and they now signed, now the new premier of Vietnam, Le Duc Tho. We signed a peace treaty, and the U.S. gets back 550 POWs. We felt there were still 2,000 that hadn't been returned. The 550 were returned. North Vietnam agrees in writing they won't attack South Vietnam. I think you need to check the North Vietnamese delegates because I think they had their fingers crossed while they were signing that. And the Viet Cong agreed to become a political party. That they would no longer be guerrilla fighters, they would become a political party that would have to run in elections. Who arranges this peace and wins the Nobel Peace Prize?
Kissinger.
Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger.
And he just passed away.
Just died just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
100? Was he 100?
100.
Yeah. Then in 1975, I'm a junior in high school, thank you. In 1975, North Vietnam, in contradiction of everything they had signed, North Vietnam launches a massive offensive against South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese fight pretty valiantly, but there's no more American help. South Vietnam falls, Saigon becomes Ho Chi Minh City, and those who helped Americans try to flee South Vietnam because they were massacred. They did everything they could to get out of there. And this is a picture you may remember of us trying to get as many Vietnamese civilians and citizens out as we could, launching from a helicopter. We launched every helicopter we had, and then when we offloaded and we were done with the helicopter trips and left the rest of the Vietnamese to be killed if they had helped the Americans, or there were kids that were part American and part Vietnamese, those kids didn't stand a chance. When we did that, this is a picture that, I don't know why it affected me. We landed on aircraft carriers and they dumped the helicopters into the ocean. They didn't bring them back to the United States, they dumped them in the ocean to get rid of them. Didn't need them anymore.
Why?
We did?
We did!
They're not gonna ever use helicopters again?
No, it's a matter of space on the ship.
You got, and the ships were overloaded. Lasting impacts, casualties. 2.5 million men served in Vietnam, 58,000 U.S. soldiers died, 300,000 U.S. soldiers wounded. Vietnamese death toll exceeds 2 million. Cambodia, because of our attacking into there, becomes a communist nation. And the group that runs Cambodia is called the Khmer Rouge. They killed 2 million people who had helped Westerners. It's absolutely a genocide. And the Khmer Rouge then goes to war with Vietnam. We thought they were friends. The Chinese helped the Khmer, the Russians helped the Vietnamese, and you've got a war there because we didn't understand who liked each other and who hated each other. Laos becomes a communist nation, and finally the United States passes the War Powers Act that limits a president's power to fight a war without Congress's permission. No more Gulf of Tonkin resolutions. Now the president can only do so much for so long it has to go to Congress and get permission. You may remember when we went into Afghanistan, George W. Bush had to go to Congress and get permission for that, whatever it was. Okay,
How did Ho Chi die anyways?
he was old,
He just died of age.
yeah.
Didn't get assassinated or anything.
Nothing good.
But now, Neil, things have changed, and you'll see a headline there, where we just did recently, LDS missionaries in Hanoi.
LDS missionaries in Hanoi. David and Kit Allred served a mission in Cambodia.
No, it's, Brooke Griffin and Brooke Peterson, whose son is there.
Here's the whole thing. Do we believe in capitalism or do we not? And the Vietnamese have taken to capitalism like they're freaking Chinese. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's profitable.
Should we have fought maybe with capitalism instead of guns and bombs and
You said Ho Chi Minh just wanted the country united.
not so united? He wanted it free, and he
Well,
never kid
okay,
yourself.
yeah.
He wanted to be in charge.
He wanted
was
to-
going to be in charge.
But he would have maybe been fine to be in charge of capitalism.
The Vietnamese, you buy a brand new pair of tennis shoes, gym shoes, they're from Vietnam. Almost surely.
Well, Lee, you were over there when it was the worst part.
Yes, he was.
Mac was there when it was kind of going.
What year were you there, man?
April 70 to 71.
You got sent over as you got sent over in 5,000 and 7,000 or 8,000 got to come home.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. He was one of
And let's just take a minute and talk about the idiotic way they brought our soldiers home. Idiotic. When they had served the tour of duty 1 year, they could come home by themselves. And so you get these soldiers who are landing in airports, and there will be a bunch of them on the plane. They're all going to different places. And there were people who showed up and spit on them. There were people who showed up with signs calling them baby killers. The way we allowed our soldiers to be treated was abysmal. And if you want to blame Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon for that, I back you 100%. That was horrible. There, Gwen's reading a book about a man who gets off, and he's in his uniform, and he's in his dress uniform, and he's walking in, and he's proud of his service. And his cousin or his brother meets him there and says, "Come with me," and took him in the bathroom and made him change his clothes. Because he says, "We're not going to get out of here safely if you're wearing that uniform." Now, I will give credit. Recently, as we brought soldiers home, they come home in their units. And when they come home, we have flags, and we have bands, and we have people out there like we should have.
And just right up the street here, it's no longer there, with Lee Peterson's barber shop, where you could get an update on it and really a lively discussion. And an old Democrat walked in and got legal.
Well, I gotta say, we haven't learned maybe everything we should have from the Vietnam War. But if I can, my messages are, how you treat your soldiers is of utmost importance. And the other thing is this, why don't you have faith in what our country stands for? Have faith in free market economy, have faith in democracy, have faith in those things. And don't go right to supporting dictators or this kind of thing. Go ahead.
95% of the people in America now have no idea what Vietnam was like, so they can't really make a good decision on how to fight war.
Well, and I have to say this too. I can't claim that I know what it was like. All I can know is what I've studied and seen, and it breaks my heart. But thank you for your service and for your service. And I can't imagine what it was like, but I can still spread the word.
Thank you.
We took a long time teaching this in high school, and hopefully they came out better for it.
I think this is why it's such an emotional issue for me, because I graduated in 1970. I've been watching the news, and because my parents moved to Salt Lake, I ended up at University of Utah. And I was young and impressionable, and so over the years, I've just swung back and forth. You know, I still think the war was unnecessary, and I still think we didn't even know what we were fighting for. But I have some huge regrets about, but this was my first step into adulthood. I just graduated from high school, went in 1970 to the University of Utah, and it's still just a really emotional thing to think back on. Sure, was I right? Was I wrong? You know, we did some things so wrong.
Well,
And yet I have such dear friends.
Look at the people, JFK, Martin Luther King Jr., RFK, Malcolm X, on and on and on. This was an era of assassinations and riots and...
Yeah,
We
it's
haven't
no
learned
wonder we were.
What's that?
We haven't learned anything.
And we haven't. Go ahead.
Just a question, the ones who treated the returning soldiers so badly,
Yeah.
is that your anti-war protesters?
A lot of them were anti-war protesters.
And that's just reprehensible that they would take their thing and treat the soldiers that way.
Exactly. I agree. I agree.
I don't think the majority of Americans would have treated him that way.
No, I don't think they did. But on the other hand,
I have lots of friends.
I think they would have treated them entirely different if they would have brought them home in their units
Yeah.
together. That would have been entirely
Like they
different
do now.
than one at a time.
They're a target one at a time.
Easy.
I came home one at a time. I was still in my jungle fatigues when I lived in the United States.
Did you have any hassles or troubles?
I stood on the highway up in Springville with my thumb out for about an hour and a half one day. Trying to get home.
Nobody was going to pick you up.
Oh my gosh. Well, you know, I graduated in 1968, and a lot of the stuff went down in 68, and I'm sorry to say, I had no idea.
Yeah, we were at the University of Utah at that time, and
I had no idea all this was going on.
Well, it just so happened that my first husband that I met was mega liberal, and my dad was a pretty conservative guy. He wasn't crazy conservative, but anyway, I was, and I would ask him, and he said, Jan, you have to form your own opinions about this. Been so much easier if you had just told me
Told you what
what
to
to do.
believe.
Even in my first election, I'm sure I
Well,
voted for
there's
George.
only one thing worse than a poor opinion, and that's an uninformed opinion.
Yeah, and
That's why I agree with you. That's why I taught this so hard in high school, is you can feel however you want about the Vietnam War, but by heck, you better understand it before you decide how you feel.
yeah, and see,
And again, I don't even claim that I really understand it, but I can explain some of it to them.
and I have some friends who came home
And
they
I-
were just fine, and others that have.
I hate to tell you, so I lived through enough of it that it affected me. But now, teachers, I see lots of history teachers, I'm not gonna blame every history teacher, but lots of history teachers are saying, here's your worksheet on the Vietnam War. Tomorrow, we'll go in to give you the next worksheet on the next thing.
Skim over.
We learned enough though, Neil, that there hasn't been anything compared to it since then.
Really?
No, there's been more, and there is constantly.
Why did we let Afghanistan go 13 years?
Afghanistan go way.
No, well,
Right.
and then why did we pull out and leave all those innocent people over there?
How were you ever gonna get out? Like,
It's just like.
Johnson had no strategy to get out of Vietnam, had no strategy on how to get out. We had,
And you have no reason to get in.
we had no strategy on how to get out. When we went into Afghanistan, we never had a strategy on how to get out.
Yeah, even after.
The only strategy we seem to have is if we build them schools and hospitals, they'll love us and everything will be fine. It's not how it works.
Well, isn't that the one the Soviets bailed out of?
Right.
And we watched it, and we cheered it, and we gave the Mujahideen weapons to help make it happen. And then when the Mujahideen changed their name to the Taliban later, they used those weapons to shoot at us.
I didn't realize that it was 13 years
Yeah,
in Afghanistan.
in Afghanistan.
See, after I got too busy later on.
And did we accomplish anything there then?
Well,
No,
We got Saddam.
I don't think so. Saddam wasn't in Afghanistan. We didn't get anything done. We did get a lot of Afghanistani people who ran for their life and came to America. Maybe that was it.
and they must hate us because their relatives were killed when we left.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful discussion. I'm sorry to go long, but thanks for being here. We'll be back next week. We will be back next week. We'll be back next week and the week after. Next week, we're going to start talking about the civil rights movement, and so I suspect it won't be any more emotional than this is. We'll see you then.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for coming.